going to be Civil Rights Lecture number 3. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the rise of kind of the grassroots civil rights movement, the emergence of the nonviolent direct action campaign, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott, and moving through into the early 60s, kind of peaking with the Birmingham campaign and the March on Washington, both of which took place in 1963. Um, those campaigns that we talked about last time were mostly focused on attempting to, end the system of racial segregation that existed in the South, to end the Jim Crow system, um, and what we're going to be turning to today is the other big target that the civil rights movement had, which was ending the system of disenfranchisement, which also existed and had existed for decades, particularly in the southern states. And this, of course, meant the denial of voting rights to blacks, despite the existence of the 15th Amendment, which technically protected voting rights regardless of race. And we discussed in our first lecture some of the methods that had been used to accomplish that disenfranchisement, whether it be literacy tests or poll taxes or um, you know, intimidation, violence. And the significance of this, of course, is that it denied the ability for blacks to exercise or to, actually gain any kind of political power. And so when the civil rights movement decided to um, try to secure voting rights, it wasn't just about voting, but it was also about giving blacks the ability to influence politics and therefore ultimately begin to attack the other parts of society, or to transform the other parts of society that had been, uh, engaging in discrimination and, um, you know, basically an unfair system based on race that existed. So we're going to be looking at two campaigns in particular that focused on voting. The first of these is Freedom Summer. So this took place in 1964 in rural Mississippi. This was a campaign organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which we discussed last time. This was a movement, or an organization rather, that emerged out of the sit-in movement, made up of mainly college-age students. And Freedom Summer was basically an effort to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. 1964 was an election year, so the goal was to get as many registrations as possible ahead of the November election of that year. Mississippi was chosen, I think, partially because it had such a large black population. African Americans made up close to, I think, 50% of the population. And so if they could really achieve a big breakthrough, those numbers could really translate into a great deal of political influence or political power. Now, this campaign was, again, organized by SNCC, led by black activists, but you also do see the participation of a number of whites in support of this campaign. You had hundreds of white Northerners, again, mostly college students who were off for the summer, who volunteered to come down and participate in this campaign. And in that respect, it was somewhat similar to the Freedom Rides, which we discussed last rotation. Another thing, though, that we see, and of course we looked at this last time as well, is the resistance that emerged from white segregationists who opposed, any kind of efforts to not just end the Jim Crow system, but to begin allowing blacks to vote as well. And so on the very first day of the Freedom Summer campaign, three activists, two white and one black, went missing. Um, their bodies were discovered a couple of months later, confirming what had been suspected, which is they had been murdered by members of the local Ku Klux Klan. And that just became sort of the first incident of what was an incredibly violent summer of various attacks, bombings that were carried out by um, groups that opposed what this campaign was trying to accomplish. Um, Now, I mentioned this was a registration campaign. It had some other aspects as well. They set up these institutions they called freedom schools, which were basically aimed at educating local blacks on political issues. Also, of course, teaching them about the process about how to go about becoming registered, but also about the issues that they might be having to vote on if they actually succeeded. Now, registering to vote and actually, gaining that right is the first step. The second question, or the question that would come after that, though, was who would these new voters actually vote for? One thing to know, if we look at party politics in the United States during this time period, um, many blacks elsewhere in the country who were able to vote had gradually migrated from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century. You go back all the way to sort of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Blacks who were voting were strongly supportive of the Republican Party, which was the party of Lincoln, and which was the party during Reconstruction that was pushing the most for expanded civil rights. As we move into the 20th century, though, and certainly once we get into the New Deal period under Roosevelt and then Truman, who we discussed had desegregated the military, the Democratic Party nationally begins to be the party that's more supportive of civil rights. Not that either party had that as a particular priority, in the first half of the 20th century, but you did see blacks beginning to move more towards the Democratic Party. Now, that's the national situation, or the situation outside of the South. In the South itself, you had basically a single party system. There was virtually no Republican Party in the South at all in the early 20th century, or even if we go back into the most of the 19th century. But the Democratic Party of the South, certainly by the 60s and over the course of the 20th century, really had become more and more distinct from the National Democratic Party in its ideology, in its priorities. It was a segregationist party, for one thing, and it was just overall a more conservative branch of the parties, particularly on social and cultural issues. And so, who were blacks in Mississippi going to vote for? I mean, to kind of point to the most dramatic, representation of this is the Mississippi Democratic Party was actually officially whites only. So blacks couldn't even join the, official Democratic Party of the state. And so, instead, a new party was formed, known as the Freedom Democratic Party, to challenge the official party of the state. Now, as I said, 1964 was an election year, and so there was a national Democratic Party convention that was held, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sent delegates. And this created a dilemma, almost a crisis, for the National Party, for President Johnson, who was being nominated to serve a second term at that convention. Because on the one hand, the official Democratic Party of Mississippi had also sent delegates, and those delegates were recognized, uh, by the National Party. And even though the Johnson administration had really started to embrace civil rights quite significantly by this point, and we're going to talk on the next slide about the Civil Rights Act, which had been passed by this point. But they didn't want to completely alienate Southern whites who still made up a major part of the Democratic Party coalition. And then on the other hand, they didn't want to sort of just totally lock out these black delegates who had shown up. So they ended up allowing them to attend the convention, but they didn't recognize them as voting members. And so that, was seen really as a slap in the face to those who had organized the Freedom Summer campaign. Now, we're going to come back to this issue of kind of the party politics of this on the next slide. But let's move on now to the Selma campaign. This took place the following year in 1965. It was a campaign that SNCC had also started, but which SCLC became involved with as well. So they ended up collaborating on this campaign, which, like Freedom Summer, was aimed at registering people to vote. This was in Selma, Alabama, and you see a lot of the tactics we've mentioned taking place here, marches, and just overall a nonviolent direct action campaign focused on this particular city. You have mass arrests that take place. You have violence that takes place carried out by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, but also by the local authorities. And not just the local Selma authorities, but ultimately it becomes such a crisis that Governor George Wallace actually sends in state troopers to Selma, ostensibly to maintain order, but ultimately they also engage in violence against activists. In one particular case, during a nighttime march, state troopers confront the marchers and begin beating them. An activist, Jimmy Lee Jackson, is actually shot and killed during this confrontation, and his death leads to this outcry and becomes a major focal point of the movement. And in fact, what SCLC decides to do is organize a march, not in Selma itself, but a march from Selma all the way to the capital of Alabama in Montgomery. This would be a 54-mile long march, and again, inspired by or instigated by this killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, and with the goal of kind of confronting the governor, confronting George Wallace in the Capitol over what was happening in Selma. And of course, more broadly, try to bring even more national attention to what was going on and to this issue of voting rights. What ends up happening, though, is that the governor declares that this march would be illegal and that it would not take place. And state troopers are positioned basically on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was the bridge that led out of Selma in the path that these marchers would have been taking or would be taking. And they were placed there to basically block the march from taking place. what ends up happening is a scene of, you know, large-scale violence carried out by the state troopers who descend upon the marchers, and this is an image on this slide of that, descend upon the marchers with clubs. They fire tear gas and begin, beating the marchers, and all of this is basically filmed. You know, this march it was known that it was going to be taking place. It was clear there was going to be some sort of confrontation on the bridge, and so you had local and national media that was present. And so the scenes of the attack, which becomes known as Bloody Sunday, get played out, on televisions across the country after it takes place. So it brings, you know, well, ironically, if Governor Wallace had been attempting to prevent this from bringing more attention to the issue by preventing the march, if anything, it just brought more attention because of the violence that took place. Now, it not only brought more attention, but it brought down more people. People flooded into Selma, whites and blacks, not just locally, but from across the country, who wanted to now basically be part of this second effort to hold a march. And so 2 weeks later, after a federal court ruled that the march, basically had to be allowed to occur under essentially, I think, First Amendment grounds, Governor Wallace ultimately relented and did allow it to go forward. And so the Selma to Montgomery March became, one of the, I mentioned the March on Washington last time as a big high point of the movement. But the Selma to Montgomery March was also certainly one of the high points of the civil rights movement as a whole. And it becomes also the catalyst ultimately for national legislation on voting rights, much as the events in Birmingham had kind of compelled Kennedy to introduce civil rights legislation, which ultimately became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Events in Selma led almost directly. In fact, it was just a few days after Bloody Sunday, and even prior to the second march taking place, that President Johnson introduced a second bill, a voting rights bill, and famously used the words, sort of the slogan of the civil rights movement, in the speech in which he announced that legislation, "We shall overcome." So let's talk about those bills and what those laws that ultimately came into existence in a little more detail now. Starting with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So again, this is the one that Kennedy introduced and which was being promoted at the March on Washington in 1963. It ultimately was passed in early 1964. By that point, Kennedy had been assassinated, and so it fell to Lyndon Johnson to try to get this pushed through Congress, and he was really instrumental in doing that. Southern senators filibustered the bill for 2 months, preventing it from even coming up for a vote, but ultimately, they did get enough support to get it up for a vote and to get it passed. Now, in terms of what this law did, actually, before I get into that, I mentioned I wanted to come back to kind of the party politics of this. So, if you look at how the votes broke down, I mentioned here Southern senators were filibustering it, and they ultimately voted against it. But again, if you look at the votes, it wasn't so much a partisan vote as much as it was a regional vote. That is to say, Southern members of Congress in both the House and the Senate almost universally voted against the Civil Rights Act. Now, those were almost all Democratic members of Congress. As I mentioned, the South was kind of solidly Democratic at this point, even though it was a Democratic president that was really pushing for the bill. Outside of the South, among both Democrats and Republicans, there was widespread support for passing the bill. That is to say, most members of Congress from outside of the South of both parties voted in favor of it. So a couple of things here. Number one, this is showing that, again, the regional split on this was quite intense. And number two, this is showing in stark relief this division between the Southern Democrats and the Democratic Party nationally. After this bill was passed, Johnson, who, by the way, was from Texas himself, which is a southern state, and he was a supporter of civil rights. So it wasn't completely a regional divide, but it largely was. But anyway, allegedly, Johnson said at the time, we just lost the South for a generation after this bill was passed. And although that didn't happen immediately, you do ultimately see the South become more and more Republican. That is to say, many Southern whites, certainly segregationists, but other Southern whites who might have just been more conservative to begin with, once that sort of Democratic Party dominance, went away, you start to see a shift more towards the Republican Party. Now, of course, this really, on the other flip side of things, secures the black vote for Democrats, which, as I mentioned, was already beginning to trend in that direction outside of the South anyway. But certainly, you see intense loyalty to the Democratic Party among blacks, since it was Democrats that, again, had pushed for this legislation the most, again, outside of the South. So, on to what the law actually did. It essentially outlawed racial and religious discrimination or segregation by government, institutions, and by businesses. So, in terms of the government, that already was starting to be done through court decisions, right? We've mentioned decisions made by the Supreme Court, which had outlawed segregation in schools. Decisions were made about buses by courts. But we also mentioned last time that private businesses, could basically discriminate as much as they wanted on whatever basis they wanted, up until this law was passed, which basically said that any business that provided public accommodations, and certainly this would include, any kind of retail store or hotel, restaurant, couldn't discriminate on the basis of race or religion. This didn't include private clubs, and so, there were still exceptions. Country clubs, for example, could still legally, be whites only, and that would, persist for some time. Nowadays, any kind of, group like that would face so much, social pressure to not discriminate that's become pretty rare. Moving on to employment. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also guaranteed equal employment opportunity regardless of race, religion, or sex, meaning it outlawed discrimination in hiring and discrimination in treatment of employees. on the basis of these three factors. Notice here the inclusion of the word sex, which wasn't mentioned or wasn't part of the clause when it came to um, basically discrimination against customers from the previous bullet point. This is kind of has a peculiar um, history to it. That is to say, you know, this bill wasn't brought about, um, or it wasn't sort of initially thought about as relating to feminism or trying to provide equal rights to women. But an amendment was added to the bill, actually by an opponent of the bill, a Southern member of Congress, adding this word to the list of things that employers couldn't discriminate on the basis of. Now, after the fact, or that is to say, this member of Congress always maintained, even though he opposed civil rights for blacks, that he believed in equal rights for women. Some have speculated, though, that this was introduced as an amendment as like a poison pill, that it was aimed at trying to defeat the bill by maybe adding something that other members of Congress might be uncomfortable with, even if they had otherwise would have supported the bill. Now, again, we don't know for sure what his motivations were, but regardless, it became kind of this almost unintended victory for the women's rights movement in terms of basically guaranteeing equal employment opportunity for women. Okay, moving on to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, this is the one that emerges out of the campaigns in Mississippi and in Selma, Alabama, that we mentioned on the previous slide. It was, again, introduced in between the first and second marches in Selma, enacted 5 months later. It prohibited voting restrictions that resulted in racial discrimination. Now, certain techniques or certain practices were outlawed directly. Literacy tests, for example, were outlawed directly. But it also used this very open-ended language that any voting restriction, even if it didn't mention race, which again, these various restrictions didn't mention race, but they were just implemented in such a way to ensure disenfranchisement, which made it tricky. Because if you just outlawed certain practices, other practices could just kind of emerge to accomplish the same goal. So this is why they wrote it in such a way that any practice that resulted in racial discrimination was banned. The second piece was ensuring enforcement of this. And so the Voting Rights Act established federal oversight over elections in states that had a history of racial discrimination in voting, which basically meant the southern states. And so starting in 1965, basically the states that fell under this restriction had to have their voting procedures approved by an agency of the federal government. Now, you might be aware, this was in the news relatively recently, just within the last couple of years, there was a Supreme Court decision that overturned this part of the Voting Rights Act. Basically, the Supreme Court ruled that enough time had passed that states that had previously had a history of voting discrimination shouldn't be held responsible for that anymore, and that there shouldn't be sort of different rules for different states in terms of having this federal oversight. But this has been controversial, and you have seen sort of in recent years more efforts to have restrictions on voting or more requirements on voting voter ID laws and the like, which again are not strictly about or not about race on the surface, but some have speculated that they might have the intent of affecting minority voters to a larger degree, or if you want to look at it a different way, maybe affecting voters of certain parties to a larger degree to have a sort of partisan benefit to them. But this is kind of an ongoing uh, issue that's being discussed. Okay, moving on to the last slide for this lecture. We're moving now outside of the South. So, first lecture we talked about how certainly racism against blacks in the United States was by no means restricted to the South. It was quite prevalent throughout the whole country. But the South is where the civil rights movement focused most of their attention because there was, you know, it was much more overt there, right? This was the de jure segregation that existed, segregation by law. And also, you had a larger population of blacks overall in the South. But in the North and in the West, especially in large cities, there were, extremely concentrated pockets of uh, of African Americans um, who were facing de facto segregation, right? Through housing discrimination, through employment discrimination, you'd have the emergence of sort of these racially segregated ghettos that received, um, you know, less funding, less sort of, worse city services. Private institutions had engaged in redlining practices, which had denied certain services to these neighborhoods. And so, um, without kind of an organized civil rights movement, to the extent that it existed in the South for sure, instead, the sort of anger and frustration about the situation, and erupted into uh, riots. And so you had, uh, beginning in 1964, a number of black riots, violence carried out, um, often triggered by particular incidents of you know police brutality, um, but also, of course, fueled by these underlying issues I was mentioning before, um, leading to large scale, violence in these neighborhoods. Two of the biggest examples of this were the Watch riot in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1965, and then the Detroit riot of 1967. So, on the one hand, these riots sort of brought attention to the racial issues that existed outside of the South. On top of that, you also have had by 1965 these big victories in the South, national legislation that really targeted the South specifically when it came to ending Jim Crow laws, ending voting discrimination, those types of practices. And so the organized civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King, turned their attention outside of the South. And in 1966, SCLC, which was King's organization, decides to basically focus on Chicago as the city that they're going to try to um, end housing discrimination practices in particular, which they felt was sort of at the root of a lot of the racial problems that existed in that city and other cities outside the South. Um, so very soon it became clear that it wasn't just white segregationists that were going to resist civil rights. as activists, marched through white neighborhoods in protest to various housing discrimination practices uh, that were in place. They also, as they had faced in the South, faced violence from opponents. Ultimately, um, Mayor Richard Daley did agree to a set of reforms, but they were never really fully implemented. Um, and so, in, the Chicago campaign is sometimes considered a failure, although ultimately it did, bring attention to the issue of housing discrimination and was a factor in eventually getting legislation passed on that issue. So over the next couple of years, King continued to focus his attention not just on issues of housing, but increasingly on other issues of economic inequality. Um, again, outside of the South, you didn't really have these set laws in place that created official segregation, but these great inequalities of income and wealth that were driven by discrimination um, became a big part of his focus. In 1968, though, King was assassinated. Uh, in the aftermath of that assassination, you see a couple of things happen. First, certainly on the negative side of things, just this big outbreak of racial riots, of black riots that occurred in over 100 cities. Um, on the other hand, in a more positive way, even prior to this, there had been, another Civil Rights Act that had been proposed that included a big focus on housing. And this part of the act becomes known as the Fair Housing Act. And so, just as Johnson, I don't think I mentioned this on the previous slide, but in 1964, Johnson had used Kennedy's assassination as kind of an argument for why the Civil Rights Act should be passed. That is to say, it was the last big domestic policy Kennedy had been pushing for to sort of honor the late president's legacy that should be passed. In a similar way, Johnson used King's death to pressure Congress to sort of honor his memory in getting the Fair Housing Act passed. So this banned housing discrimination on the basis of race or religion, in the same way that the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act had tried to ban discrimination in terms of private businesses, for discrimination against consumers and employees, and then discrimination in voting. Okay, so we will end the lecture there. We have one more lecture to do for this unit, and really the last lecture of the year, which will be in 2 rotations. So be on the lookout for that. We'll be looking at the emergence of sort of the Black Power movement, the influence of Malcolm X, this sort of alternative strain of the civil rights movement.